In 1893, in the shadow-draped town of Havendale, Pennsylvania, something monstrous and sacred converged, an entity both human and transcendent, born of suffering, silenced by power, and buried by shame. This is the story of the giant slave woman who required 6 men to restrain her and ultimately killed them all with her chains. We embark on a descent into forgotten corruption, institutional control, and ancient trauma that festered behind closed doors. Nestled at the foot of the Allegheny Hills, Havendale looked like a tranquil American town. Whitewashed churches, coal smoke from chimneys, children's laughter on cobblestone streets. Yet beneath that facade the town harbored the ever-present echo of the orphanage, the seminary, the church basement where power mingled with secrecy. In 1890, the town's industrial boom drew families in, but as prosperity rose, so too did the silences. Old ledger books mention the Havendale Orphan and Industrial School for Girls, staffed by stern women of the cloth, funded by the Presbyterian diocese, its children kept in disciplined rows, their voices faint. The institution functioned as both shelter and exploit. Whispers say girls were bound by more than age. They were bound by debt, by ideology, by a legacy of bondage older than America itself. Into this world came a slave woman, though she was no longer enslaved in the legal sense. Yet the chains of memory held her still. At 7 feet tall, she towers over the chapel's pews, the orphan school hallways, the darkness beneath the pulpit. She embodies trauma passed down, an inheritance of silence. The institutional men and women of Havendale could not see her properly. They only saw the giant as a spectacle, an anomaly, something to be hidden. And hide they did. Her name was Sylvia Jacobs, born in the fading days of Reconstruction in the heart of Virginia's tobacco fields. At 16, she measured nearly 6 feet. By her 20s, she had outgrown even the tallest barn rafters. She arrived in Havendale in late autumn of 1892, brought under contract to the Orphan and Industrial School, ostensibly as a house assistant and guardian aide. Few documents mention her height. What they do note is her quiet gaze, the way the orphans shrank from her, and that she slept fully clothed, chains by her bedside. She was technically free, yet the institutional machinery of the town treated her as something else. The church mothers gave her the tasks no one else wanted: the midnight refugee watch, the locked door patrol, the basement crawlspace cleaning. They bound her wrists when they thought she might overreach. The 6 men of the town, trustees of the orphanage, prominent businessmen, agreed to supervise her. They tied heavy iron chains round her ankles during inspection hours, reasoning, "She is strong beyond measure, for her own sake." But chains do not contain the wound, they amplify it. Sylvia's chains dragged like echoes of her ancestors' shackles. Her eyes held darkness deeper than the coal mines outside town. The camera of memory zooms into the orphan school basement. Damp stone walls, dripping water, a rotten wooden door that creaks as she enters. At night, she whispered to the children, her voice soft as velvet, her shadow stretching 7 feet across the floor. The trustees heard rumors, girls vanishing, cries muffled, but they silenced them with prayer and threat. The Orphan and Industrial School looked respectable: white columns, a red brick annex, a chapel bell that tolled every morning at 6. But inside lay a hierarchy forged by the same logic that once underpinned slavery. The girls were taught to be industrious, meek, grateful. The trustees, the 6 men, oversaw everything: dorms, wages, grievances, medical care. The church mothers reported only to them, and the town council had little oversight. Sylvia's presence disrupted the order. At dinner, her elbows reached farther than the children's table. Her voice echoed down the hallways. Yet the trustees presented her as a model of tamed strength, a living testament to the institution's power. To control her was to show the world they were superior. They called her the giant house assistant, or the Sentinel. But no one spoke of her past. No one asked about how she came to wear chains again when the law said she was free. Inside the chapel, the cross loomed large, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. The church mothers whispered that God had chosen Sylvia for this work. But other voices, the ones you don't hear, wondered whether God had abandoned her first, and the institution picked up the debt. Chains rattle in the basement, echoes in the night, footsteps on damp cement. The orphanage runs its machines of order while the unspeakable shivers in its bowels. They were pillars of Havendale, a banker, a coal mine owner, a former Confederacy courier, aged now, the town's richest doctor, a railroad magnate, and a lawyer who handled church affairs. They wanted to believe in civil progress, in philanthropy, in the redeeming power of religion. Their cover photo on the orphanage board shows them smiling, arm in arm, beneath the chapel's portico. Their interest in Sylviane seemed benevolent at first, to supervise her, to anchor her in the institution's daily rhythms, to ensure she fit. They recruited 6 muscular men to restrain her when needed. At inspections, the chains came out. At night, she walked the orphan corridors, supervised by their gloved hands. But the iron they fastened on her ankles was not just physical, it was symbolic. They were reenacting a ritual of submission, of dominance. At midnight, they gathered for monthly audits. The orphanage's ledgers showed no deficits, but missing entries, late fees, and injuries reported as accidental. The 6 men looked at Sylviane differently in those meetings, sometimes with admiration, sometimes fear. They whispered in the trustee room, "She is beyond us." But they did nothing, because the institution depended on silence, on concealment. And then one night, the noise began. The orphanage's West Dormitory housed 14 girls, aged 8 to 15. One evening in March 1894, a girl named Anna Mae Willis failed to appear for chapel prayers. The chains were heard dragging in the basement at roughly 11:03 p.m. At midnight, the door to the West Dormitory was locked. At 1:17 a.m., the chains stopped. By dawn, Anna Mae was missing. No trace. The 6 men claimed they had done their rounds. The church mothers promised prayers. The town whispered something darker, but only behind closed doors. Sylviane had been on patrol that night. 2 men escorted her. She returned alone, her chains dragging, her eyes distant. She said nothing. The trustees asked her questions. "Why didn't you stop the disappearance?" She replied only, "I was busy." But they saw the bruise on her wrist, the new shackles fastened extra tight. She refused to talk. The church mothers told the girls that Anna Mae's father had taken her away. The orphan school books were changed. The basement inspection records vanished. Yet the air of the dormitory changed. The other girls huddled at night, hearing echoing footsteps, chains, a low humming. Someone whispered they had seen a tall shape in the window. But they didn't dare tell. Because when one speaks, they risk both shame and violence. The institution held all the cards and the secrets. Chain links are cold. Metal against skin, teeth grit echoes, the scrape of rust on stone. For Sylviane, the chains were a reminder of something ancestral, the unsung suffering of enslaved women, the trauma that lived in marrow. She wore them willingly sometimes, in late hours, dragging them down corridors as though grounding herself in the reality of her body. But even when the chains were removed, the echo remained, the hollow ring, the vibration through the floorboards, the whispered moans in the basement. In one scene, she enters the orphanage chapel after hours. The wooden pews are polished, the hymnals immaculate. She sits in the back row, the chains rest at her feet. A candle flickers. She watches the cross, and tears trace tracks down her cheeks. The memory, picking tobacco under the Virginia sun, the whip before night, the escape to North, the promise of freedom that never fully freed her. The institution of Havendale assumed they had saved her, but in truth, they re-imprisoned her in a different order. The boys in the wagon yard heard her at dusk, ominous whistles, a low hum, the click of iron on stone. They thought it was the wind. The trustee dismissed them. The orphan girls thought it was a ghost. The church mothers said it was the spirit. No one asked what kind of spirit it was, and no one asked what the chains were truly holding in place. Within the orphanage's private archives, accessible only to the 6 trustees, there lay a record labeled Item Number 78, the Sentinel's monthly binding. Notes in shaky handwriting. We observe her may exceed. We limit with iron link. Ensure she does not exceed the dormitory boundaries. The language spoke of containment, of something wild. The binding occurred at midnight monthly, in the basement crawl space, with only the trustees present. The chains soaked in oil beforehand. The ritual broadcast through the empty halls as clinks and murmurs. The church mothers believed this ritual kept the girls safe. Deep down, the trustees believed it kept something out. But the truth was more pernicious. They were keeping something in. The trauma, the rage, the giant's body, her unspeakable power. They feared it if unleashed. They feared it erupting across the town, upending the neat rows of homes and churches and industry. On the day of the ritual, the camera pans to a hushed corridor. The orphans pause at their doors as the congregation of men descend into the basement. On the foot of the giant's bed lies a ledger, brains of the institution. The chains wrap around wrists and ankles, and the giant stares into space, eyes oscillating between calm and storm. The foundations of the building tremble, or is it just the echo of her internal quake? The ritual ends with the chains locked, the lights extinguished, and a single whisper. She is contained, for now. In the spring of 1895, a local newspaper, the Havendale Gazette, ran a brief piece. Orphanage trustee Mr. Richard M. Ward resigns amidst unspecified concerns. But the article was buried on page 7, the headline half hidden between adverts for coal and train schedules. Yet the real corruption lay below. The orphanage's accounts hid leasing of girls to textile mills, hush payments to families whose children disappeared, and tallies marked Special Project, Sentinel, under blank lines. Investigative whispers among town clerks. Children returned with bruises, orphans kept in isolation, the giant taken away at nights to the basement crawlspace. One clerk wrote in a private journal, they were saving her, or they were saving themselves from her. But the journal was never published. The church mothers shredded it when the scandal threatened the donation stream. The deeper truth, the institution folded the logic of slavery into charity. The giant slave woman was both symbol and sacrifice. The town believed her presence elevated them, as though to say, look what we have tamed. But in truth, she held the mirror to their complicity. Racism, exploitation, the commodification of bodies in Christian garb. The chains were not just restraint, they were language. They spelled out the suppressed trauma of families, of enslaved ancestors, of orphaned children forced to work for free. The town of Havendale felt secure even as the foundations cracked. The clock tower chimed midday. The chains lay in silence, waiting. Late summer, 1896. A summer thunderstorm rattled the orphanage windows. Sylviane woke at 2 a.m., sweating, the heavy chains missing from the floor. The basement door stood ajar. She shivered in her nightdress. The camera follows her footsteps. Wooden stairs creak, stone hallways glisten with water. At the end of the corridor, a sliver of moonlight falls across the door to the west dormitory. Inside, the girls huddle under blankets. One whispers, she's coming. Sylviane crosses the threshold. The girls recoil, but not in fear of her. In fear of what she carries. She approaches the last bed in the row and sits. A young girl trembles and asks, why do you wear chains if you're free? The giant's voice soft as dusk, because freedom was never mine to keep. The girls look at her chains, the heavy links dragging on the floor like graves. She puts her hand on the bedpost, and the wood echoes the ring of iron. Outside the windows, lightning splits the sky. A deep rumble. The institution's facade seems to flicker. The trustees heard the thunder, but they interpreted it as nature. They did not hear the real rumble, the giant's wrath awakening. The basement lights blinked. A panel of the crawlspace hatch fell open. The camera pans to it, the darkness beneath. The night breathes. The nights at Havendale would never be the same. On October 10th, 1896, at precisely 11:47 p.m., 6 men entered the basement crawlspace. They carried lanterns, clipboards, and handcuffs. They called it a routine inspection of the Sentinel's binding. The air was close, stone walls damp, the chains laid out on a low table. In a hush, they locked her ankles, then moved to her wrists. One man flicked his lantern beam across her face. The giant's eyes glowed under the lantern light, abyssal, patient, terrible. They asked her to rise. She stood, 7 feet tall in the narrow corridor, her chains clinking. The men stiffened. They tried to secure another link. One misjudged the height of her limb. The chain snapped. She laughed. A sound like thunder in the cave. The 6 men froze. Their lanterns shook. The space constricted. The giant moved with sudden speed. One chain looped around a leg. Another circled a wrist. They tried to pull away, but she pulled the chain. Metal against flesh. A man cried out. She pivoted, the chain trailing in arcs of silver light, striking like a flail. The corridor erupted in echoes, screams, clanging metal, shuffling boots, gasps. The lanterns fell. At the end, only darkness and the giant silhouette against stone. By morning, the basement was locked. The chain lay broken. The bodies of the 6 men never found. The official statement: they left town without notice. The church declared silence. The town awakened in a haze. The truth slept in the crawlspace. The morning sun found the orphanage unchanged. Children in uniform, chapel bell ringing, trustees meeting over coffee. No one mentioned the 6 men. The record book had an entry: trustees absent on inspection tour. That was all. A hush descended. The chains vanished from inventory. The basement hatch was sealed. The ledger's page was missing. Families of the missing men arrived to press for answers, but were met with polite condolences and sealed lips. The church mothers guided them to hymns, not investigations. The coal mine owner on the board quietly sold his shares and moved west. The lawyer destroyed his notes. The banker stopped his donations to the school and sat quietly. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. It preferred calm over truth. Meanwhile, Sylvian's presence changed. She no longer wore the chains openly. At night, she prowled the orphan halls without restraint. Her shadow stretched 7 feet long under the dorm lights. The girls noticed. The trustees noticed. But no one spoke, because speaking risked unveiling the secret they had all agreed to bury. The Giant's Act had torn open something. The institutions that promised safety were built on fear. Now the fear lived free. 10 years later, many of the girls from the West Dormitory still trembled at night. They remembered the sound: dragging chains, snapping metal, mad laughter. They remembered the giant stepping over the threshold, standing between corridors, the chain ends swinging like pendulums. One of them, Evelyn Hart, recalled, "She didn't kill us. She saved us from them." Others remember feeling safe in her presence, though they dared not say so publicly. In the leaving camp of life, when they married, moved away, had children, the memory followed. The institutional lullabies became nightmares. The church hymns echoed with the giant's hum. The chain's ring haunted their dreams. They spoke in whispers. "Do you remember the night? Do you still hear the chain?" They buried the memory in silence. The town's history books never recorded it. The orphanage changed names in 1910, but the memory of the giant remained. Their trauma was collective but unspoken. The institution made them believe that the giant was the danger. But in older age they saw it differently. The danger was the institution, the corruption, the complacency. The giant was the reaction, the wound making itself known. And the chains, they symbolized more than restraint. They symbolized the weight of unacknowledged injustice. In 1903, the local seminary owned by the Presbyterian diocese acquired part of the orphanage grounds. The chapel and dormitories were repurposed. A new generation of ministers walked the halls where the giant once roamed. Some heard footsteps at 2 a.m. Some found rust flakes on polished stone. One lecturer, Reverend Jacobs, no relation, wrote in his diary, "A 7-foot shadow moves when no one is about." The chains ring beneath the floor. He abandoned the job. As the seminary expanded, new windows were cut, new bricks laid. But there was one door sealed with metal plates, unmarked, locked since 1896. The students were told never to open it. Whispers circulated. That's where the Sentinel was bound. No official records acknowledged it. The chapel's stained glass window changed in 1912. New panels depict benevolent shepherds and lambs. None show the giant. But sometimes, in twilight, you can trace the outline of a figure behind the glass, its height unequal to the others, its shadow long. The seminary's curriculum preached redemption, the power of the church, the sanctity of charity. Yet beneath those sermons lay the same structure: authority, suppression, control. The giant had been their mirror, showing them the ancient trauma beneath the holy veneer. The seminarians felt it. The trustees ignored it. And the town moved onward, leaving the sealed door unopened, the chains untended, the giant unspoken. In 1924, when the orphanage turned seminary hosted an alumni gathering, a former dorm girl, now in her 30s, brought a photograph. It showed the giant, standing next to one of the trustees, her height immense, even seated. The caption, "Sylvian Jacobs, 1893. The trustees gasped, the church mothers paled. They forced the photograph's removal. but copies circulated among the alumni. It sparked memory. Late that night, alumni sat around a lantern in the chapel crypt. They talked about the missing men, the chains, the giant. Some claimed to have seen scars on their backs from the bindings. Others said they heard her whisper in the dorm corridor, "I could not save you from the chains, so I broke them." The emotions surged. Anger at the institutions, sorrow for the girls, fear of the giant's silence. The gathered faces were lit by candle glow, solemn, haunted, awakened. This return of memory threatened the town's tidy narrative. The trustees convened. They urged silence. The diocese intervened. But the alumni were done hiding. They realized the giant had not been the monster they had been. The giant had been the reaction to their corruption, the bulwark of the institution's lies. The chains had been theirs. The giant had shattered them. One stormy night in 1932, nearly 40 years after the deed, the seminary's basement hatch blew open during a gale. A lightning bolt struck the chapel tower. The windows cracked. The power failed. The students gathered by candlelight as one professor entered the sealed door. Inside, the crawlspace. Cold, damp. The chains still lay there, broken links rusted and gleaming under torchlight. Printings of names on ledger plates, 6 men. Sylvian's name inscribed in fading ink. The professor crouched, ran his fingers through the dust. The metallic scent rose. He heard footsteps behind him, heavy, measured. He turned and saw a shadow at the far end of the corridor, 7 feet tall. No chain, no man holding it, just a figure. He froze. The figure raised a long arm. The chain at its side snagged on the floor. The professor's candle dropped. The corridor exploded into darkness. He fled up the stairs. Outside, the storm raged. The basilica bell tolled unbidden. The seminary walls groaned. In the morning, the sealed door stood open. The chains gone. The crawlspace deserted. The seminary board insisted it was just storm damage. But the professor resigned. The students whispered. She walked free. The institution could not hide it this time. From 1932 forward, the town of Havendale carried a shift in its bones. The seminary closed in 1940. The orphan school charter revoked in 1942. The buildings demolished in 1947. Yet the scars remained. Broken windows, rusted foundation bolts, chain marks on basement walls. The families of the 6 men declared them missing in action and accepted pensions. But those pensions came with a condition: silence. The girls who had survived, now women in their 50s, spoke only in private. They called themselves the chain-scarred, though no one saw the scars. The giant, Sylvian Jacobs, became a whispered legend, tall, terrible, liberating. Some claimed she moved back south, to the old tobacco fields. Others said she melted into the forests around Havendale, becoming part myth, part memory. None dared ask what truly happened that night. The institutional decor changed. Brick buildings retired, hedgerows planted. But the architecture of control persisted. Town meetings, church boards, orphanages renamed. The chains had shifted, become intangible. Silence, fear, guilt. The giant had broken the metal, but not the memory. And that memory would haunt the town's waking hours, its dreams, its children's nightmares. At the heart of this story lies trauma. Not just personal, but generational. Sylvian's body held the weight of slavery's legacy. The orphan girls bore the weight of abandonment. The 6 men embodied the weight of institutional authority. The chains symbolized the system, visible, tactile, brutal. But when the chains broke, the trauma didn't vanish. It transformed. It seeped into minds, into subconscious corridors. The girls heard the chain. The men feared the giant. The institution feared both. Psychologically, Havendale became a microcosm of America's suppressed shame. The giant slave woman is less a monstrous figure and more a mirror, reflecting the hidden corruption of charitable institutions built on exploitation. The difficulty of liberation when your body is still tethered by memory. The fact that sometimes the ones restrained are the ones holding the truth. The orphan girls' nightmares echo this. They dream of being chained, of dragging bodies, of giant footsteps overhead. But they also dream of rising, of the giant's wings breaking. In the sequence of events, the giant's violence is not gratuitous, it's cathartic. She kills the men bound to maintain her chains. But more deeply, she destroys the facade. The audience watching this story is invited to descend into that darkness. not to feel safe, but to feel uncomfortable. To contemplate how institutions claim to protect while perpetrating harm. How freedom is more than removing the chains. It's unraveling the system that put them on. Every detail in the story carries symbolism. The chains, heritage of slavery, institutional bondage, unseen trauma. The giant's height, the looming presence of history, of unspoken violence, of memory. The orphan school, America's undercarriage, abandoned children, paternalistic charity, hidden labor. The 6 men, gatekeepers of power, enforcers of order, owners of silence. The basement, the unconscious, the versus of the public facade. The storm, upheaval, truth breaking through. And the church? The chapels cross atop the hill visible to all, yet inside the walls, secrets festering. The cross becomes inverted in the basement. The institution's faith becomes weaponized. The trust becomes bondage. When the giant breaks free, the chapel bell still rings, but its tone changes. Not salvation, but reckoning. The town's clock tower chimes, but the time is off. The foundations shift. The iron corrodes. Thus, this story is not simply about horror. It's about memory, guilt, and institutional complicity. It's about a giant figure walking among small men, and the small men trying to cage the giant so the town can still feel safe. But safety built on suppression is brittle. It cracks when the giant stands. In present day, the land where the orphan school and seminary once stood is a quiet park. A rusted chain half buried in grass emerges after heavy rain. Local kids pull it free and laugh. Looks like a giant's toy. The townspeople smile politely and walk on. But the chain is real. It rings in the dark. The night wind whistles through the foundations beneath the grass. We will never know the full truth. Did the giant walk away into the forest? Did she vanish into myth? Did she return to the tobacco fields or sink into the soil? Perhaps. But her story remains, a ghost in the American psyche. She is the reminder that freedom is incomplete until we unbind the systems that kept us chained, that power is hollow if built on silence, that the forgotten event still echoes. And in that echo you can hear chains. In that echo you can sense footsteps. In that echo you remember. Some histories weren't meant to be buried. Some giants weren't meant to be chained. And some truths aren't meant to be hidden.